The desert sun burned white above Fort Raven Arsenal, the air trembling with heat over the long stretch of concrete that marked Range 12. It was 2:30 p.m., the kind of afternoon that made the metal benches too hot to touch. A cluster of young officers and NCOs stood behind the firing line, their eyes hidden behind dark ballistic glasses, their uniforms crisp and precise. The air smelled of CLP oil and baked dust as the crew prepared for a live-fire evaluation of the M210 Enhanced Sniper Weapon System. Captain Ryan Thorne, in charge of the test, carried himself like a man posing for a recruiting poster. His voice cut across the range, confident and sharp, giving last-minute instructions as if the generals themselves were listening. A few of the younger lieutenants shifted nervously, aware that this test could influence promotions, funding, and reputations. Thorne thrived in that pressure. He liked eyes on him. He liked being the man in charge. Then, from the far end of the concrete apron, movement caught everyone's attention. A woman in an olive-drab maintenance jumpsuit walked slowly toward the firing line. A large Pelican rifle case balanced effortlessly in her grip. Her pace was unhurried. Her expression unreadable. Her steps steady as if she had every right to be there. Thorne watched her approach with growing irritation, the corners of his mouth twisting into a smirk. He stepped forward, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ma'am, this is a live fire evaluation, not a bake sale. Are you lost?" The officers around him chuckled, the kind of forced laughter that came more from obedience than humor. The woman didn't react. She stopped beside the firing bench, set the heavy case down, and brushed the dust from her sleeve. Her movements were controlled and economical, each one deliberate. For a moment, Thorne hesitated, thrown off by how calm she seemed. Then he folded his arms and looked to his men, as if daring them to laugh again. Up in the observation tower, Colonel Marcus Vance lowered his binoculars, the faint trace of curiosity crossing his weathered face. From 200 yards away, he noticed the small things that Thorne missed. The way her boots were set shoulder-width apart, the balanced line of her posture, the way her hands gripped the case handle, not with strain, but familiarity. It was the stance of someone who knew weapons the way a pilot knew his aircraft. Vance leaned forward, eyes narrowing, the quiet hum of recognition stirring in his chest. On the range below, Thorne's smirk returned. He barked at a range safety NCO to check the perimeter, his tone clipped and performative. The officers nodded and moved, their discipline rigid but uneasy. The woman remained still, her gaze steady on the distant horizon. The dry wind picked up, sweeping sand across the firing lane, carrying the faint metallic tang of gun oil and brass. In that moment, the difference between noise and control filled the air. The captain's authority was loud, brittle, and practiced. Hers was silent, unspoken, and absolute. Captain Thorne let out a short laugh, the kind that carried more ego than humor. He took a few slow steps toward the woman, stopping just close enough for his shadow to fall across her case. His voice rose again, smooth but sharp, as if he was lecturing a classroom instead of addressing a soldier. He started explaining the evaluation, tossing out terms like ballistic coefficient, spin drift, and the Coriolis effect, each word clipped and deliberate. He said them not to teach, but to remind everyone within earshot that he was the smartest man on the range. The young officers behind him nodded quickly, trying to look engaged, while the sergeants exchanged small, wary glances. The woman said nothing. She didn't even look at him. She brushed a bit of sand off the firing bench and began checking the surface, her movements unhurried and fluid. The metallic snaps of her gloves and the dull thud of the case echoed faintly under Thorne's running commentary. He leaned closer, pretending to help her understand the complexity of the test. His words dipped in mock patience. Out past the line, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of oil and brass. The sound of distant targets swaying on their mounts. Sergeant Miller stood just behind the captain, his hands folded at parade rest. Watching her work, he'd been in long enough to recognize confidence when he saw it. The kind that came from muscle memory and repetition, not arrogance. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, unlocking clamps and wiping dust from the table with a rag pulled from her pocket. Miller noticed the faint silver lines of old scars across her knuckles, the kind left by years of handling steel, not paperwork. Something in his gut told him to stay quiet, to wait. Thorne kept talking, his tone growing sharper. Frustrated by her silence, he wanted a reaction, a sign that his authority still held, but she gave him nothing. The laughter that had followed his earlier insult had faded, leaving only the low hum of tension. A few of the younger soldiers shifted uneasily, unsure if they were watching a mistake or something they couldn't yet name. Thorne straightened, pointing toward her case with mock authority. "Sergeant Miller, escort this woman out of here." His voice was louder than it needed to be, cracking slightly at the edge. Miller hesitated. The woman paused, her hands resting on the case latches. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with steady hands and perfect calm, she began to open it. The lid lifted with a heavy hiss, revealing a rifle that didn't belong to any inventory list on Fort Raven Arsenal. Nestled in black foam was a weapon built with obsessive precision, a custom variant of the M210 enhanced sniper weapon system. Its barrel was fluted and weight-balanced, the matte gray receiver worn smooth in places where a hand had rested countless times before. The scope mounted on top was larger than standard issue, the turrets engraved with symbols no one recognized. Every inch of it spoke of craftsmanship, not factory production. Near the trigger guard, faint but unmistakable, was a laser-etched centaur drawing a bow. The image was small, understated, and yet it drew the eye. It was a mark no one there had seen before, except for one man. From the observation tower, Colonel Marcus Vance froze. Through his binoculars, he could see that insignia as clearly as the memory it carried. Project Chron. The words formed in his mind like a ghost. It had been over a decade since he had last seen that symbol, tied to a classified program run under the asymmetric warfare group, the Ghosts of the Forge. They had been called soldiers who built, plant, wrote, and fought with the same weapons they created. Each one had been a legend, a living encyclopedia of ballistics and combat craft. He had assumed the program was dead, buried under red tape and forgotten reports. But here, on Range 12, was proof that one of them still existed. On the line below, Captain Thorne scowled. He saw none of that history, only an obstacle standing in front of his perfect test. His voice cut through the dry air, loud and irritated, as if volume could restore his control. Then, the unexpected happened. A shout erupted from the main firing station. "Rifle 1 is down." The bolt seized. Thorne turned sharply, his confidence cracking. The extractor claw had snapped off, wedged into the chamber. The marksman struggled, trying to mortar the weapon safely without causing damage. The range filled with the anxious noise of tools clattering by soldiers muttering, and procedure unraveling. Through it all, the woman didn't move faster. She didn't even look up. Her focus remained locked on her rifle as she assembled it with methodical precision. She attached the bipod, tested the mount, adjusted the optic with a torque wrench from her pocket. The sound of metal against metal was clean and deliberate. She slid a single cartridge from her jumpsuit, a dark bronze casing tipped with a matte black bullet, a custom 408 Chatak round, hand-loaded, impossibly rare. The brass caught the sunlight for a moment before she chambered it with a smooth, controlled motion. The click of the bolt closing echoed louder than any shout. The noise on the range died down. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, and the silence felt heavier than the desert heat. She lowered herself to the ground, movements fluid and precise. The kind of economy that comes only from years of repetition, her elbows pressed into the hot concrete, bipod legs biting into the surface. The rifle settling like an extension of her own body. The stock met her shoulder with perfect alignment. Her cheek rested against the comb of the rifle, finding that exact spot where sight picture, muscle tension, and breathing formed a single rhythm. The target was a hostage-style steel plate, 2,200 meters away. A small, circular 3-inch opening marked the only safe zone. The kill point. The rest of the silhouette represented a life that could not be risked. The wind had picked up, dragging waves of heat and dust across the range. The mirage shimmered, flowing left to right. She studied it, not consciously calculating but feeling its pattern. Her breathing slowed until it barely stirred her chest. The reticle steadied, the crosshairs floating like they were part of the Earth's rotation. Around here, no one dared to speak. The only sound was the distant creak of target frames shifting in the wind and the faint metallic tick of brass cooling beside her. Even the desert seemed to wait. Captain Thorne stood behind her, jaw tight. His voice caught somewhere between disbelief and anger. He wanted to stop her but couldn't find the words. His team watched, their earlier confidence replaced by uneasy fascination. They didn't know what they were seeing, only that it felt wrong to interrupt. In the tower, Colonel Vance had stopped breathing. He recognized the stillness, the absolute control before a shot that would decide everything. She exhaled once, long and steady. Holding at the bottom of her breath, the trigger came alive under her finger, pressure building in the pad until movement ceased to exist. Then the rifle fired. It didn't snap or roar. It exhaled. The recoil pushed straight back into her shoulder, smooth and linear, the muzzle barely lifting. A supersonic crack cut the air, rolling out into the desert. For 2 full seconds, there was nothing. Then a sound came drifting back across the range, light and clean. A ping of steel, the unmistakable ring of a perfect hit. No one spoke. No one moved. The soldiers stared downrange, disbelieving. Sergeant Miller raised his spotting scope with trembling hands and whispered under his breath that she had hit dead center. The shot had threaded through the hostage aperture without touching the edges. Captain Thorne's face went pale. All noise and arrogance drained away. The silence was deeper now, heavy with realization. Colonel Vance reached for the range intercom, his voice calm and final as it filled the air. Captain Thorne, stand down. The echo of the shot still lingered when Colonel Marcus Vance stepped back from the observation window. For a long moment, he said nothing, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the woman below. The entire firing line had gone silent. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Then the colonel turned, pushed open the metal door, and began his descent down the tower steps. Each footfall rang against steel, sharp and deliberate, like a countdown that everyone on the range could feel. The soldiers standing in formation stiffened instinctively, spines straightening as their commander crossed the open stretch of sun-bleached concrete toward the prone shooter. The air shimmered around him, the desert heat bending light and sound. Captain Ryan Thorne stood frozen in place, his expression a pale mask of disbelief and humiliation. His men still held their rifles at rest, eyes darting between their captain and the woman lying behind the weapon that had just performed the impossible. Colonel Vance reached the firing line, stopped beside her, and studied the rifle resting on its bipod. He didn't speak at first. His gaze traced the barrel, the optic, and finally the faint centaur insignia etched near the trigger guard. When his fingers brushed the mark, recognition struck. He exhaled slowly, his voice quiet but steady. Project Chron. The words seemed to weigh the air around him. He had not heard that name in over a decade. Not since the asymmetric warfare group's most ambitious program had been shuttered. Its graduates had been called the ghosts of the forge. Soldiers forged to master every facet of the weapon system. They could design it, build it, program its ballistics, and fire it under any condition known to man. Only 4 had ever earned that title. He looked up at her, then turned to Thorn. "Do you have any idea who you've been talking to?" Captain Thorn's mouth opened, but no words came. He glanced at his men, then at the woman, who was now calmly clearing the chamber and setting the rifle safe. His voice cracked when he finally answered, "Sir, she's not on any of the rosters. I don't even know her name." The colonel gave a small, humorless laugh, the kind that carried no joy. "No, Captain, you wouldn't. People like her don't appear on your lists. They write the doctrine you memorize." He straightened, his voice carrying farther now, directed at the entire line. "You are looking at Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed, one of only 4 graduates of Project Chron. She is a living repository of technical and tactical mastery. The rifle you saw today was her own design, the prototype that inspired the M210. She has more confirmed operational deployments than your entire company combined, and she was sent here by direct Pentagon order to evaluate this program, not to disrupt it, to observe it." A murmur rippled through the ranks, then died as quickly as it began. Thorn's face turned red with shame. Colonel Vance stepped closer, his voice lower now, carrying the weight of command. "You were so concerned with your own authority, Captain, that you failed to recognize the real thing standing right in front of you." The silence stretched between them, then Vance turned back toward Reed. She stood, her posture straight but relaxed, rifle slung at her side. The colonel drew himself to full height, heels clicking together, and raised his hand to his brow in a perfect salute. It was a gesture rarely seen directed upward, a breach of military protocol so profound that it froze every soldier where they stood. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but resonant. "Ma'am, on behalf of this command, my deepest respect." The salute held for a long second, then lowered. Reed met his gaze, her face calm, unreadable. She gave the slightest nod, a simple acknowledgement that needed no words. The entire firing line understood. Authority had shifted, not by rank, but by skill. In that moment, the woman who had been mocked for her silence became the center of gravity for everyone present. And when she turned to walk away, not a single soldier moved until she was gone. For a few seconds after the colonel's salute, no one breathed. The desert wind pushed across the range, carrying dust and silence in equal measure. Every soldier on the line felt the weight of what they had just witnessed. When Evelyn Reed finally turned and walked off the firing line, her steps steady and unhurried. No one followed. They stood at attention, eyes locked forward, understanding that they had seen something that would outlive any official report or data log. By the next morning, the story had spread across Fort Raven Arsenal like wildfire. It moved through the maintenance bays, across the armory, and into the officers' mess. Privates whispered about the colonel saluting a warrant officer. NCOs retold the details of the shot, each version more reverent than the last. Some said she had hit a target the size of a coin. Others said the wind had been blowing at 30 knots. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the lesson. Competence was quiet. And now everyone on the base knew it. Within a week, the spot where she had lain prone was cut out of the concrete and replaced with a brass plaque. It bore only 3 words: "Competence is quiet." In the mornings, new soldiers would pause there before their range drills, not out of superstition, but respect. The culture began to shift. Officers asked more questions and spoke less. Sergeants carried themselves with renewed pride. The noise of arrogance had been replaced by the stillness of professionalism. Captain Ryan Thorn spent those days in silence. He replayed every word he had said, every smug glance and careless assumption. The memory of the shot echoed in his mind. not as humiliation, but as a reminder of what real mastery looked like. A week later, at 7:15 a.m., he walked to the small workshop tucked behind the testing hangar where Chief Reed worked. The faint scent of gun oil hung in the air, steady and familiar. She was cleaning her rifle, her movements calm and precise, as if nothing had happened at all. He stood at attention, voice steady but stripped of pride. He admitted his arrogance, his ignorance, and the way he had failed his men. She didn't respond right away. She just continued her work, her hands quiet and deliberate. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. She studied him for a moment that felt longer than it was, then nodded once. She picked up the rifle's bolt, holding it between them. "The first lesson," she said, "is to watch and listen before you speak. The second is that a weapon is only as good as the hands that care for it." She handed him the bolt, her gaze level. "Let's start there." He took it without hesitation. That morning marked the beginning of something new. Not punishment, not penance. A leçon, one learned not in noise, but in silence. A year had passed since the shot that silenced Fort Raven Arsenal. The desert looked the same, endless and dry beneath a pale blue sky. But something about the base had changed. The arrogance that once filled the air had faded into quiet purpose. On Range 12, where the legend began, a brass plaque gleamed at the edge of the firing line. Its surface caught the sunlight. The words carved deep and simple. "Competence is quiet." Major Ryan Thorne stood before a line of new second lieutenants, their uniforms crisp, their faces untested. It was 900 hours, and the desert heat was already rising. But no one fidgeted. Thorne wasn't the man he had been. His voice carried calm authority, not volume. His posture held confidence, not ego. He looked at the plaque for a moment before turning back to the young officers. He began telling the story, not from the viewpoint of a hero, but from the perspective of a man who had once been blind to true leadership. He spoke of the day a woman in a maintenance jumpsuit walked onto the range and how his pride mistook her silence for weakness. He told them about the impossible shot, the sound that changed everything, and the salute that rewrote rank itself. He didn't spare himself. He described his own arrogance, the hollow need to be right, and how it crumbled when faced with someone who had no need to prove anything. The lieutenants listened quietly, eyes fixed on him, their earlier bravado replaced by something more thoughtful. Thorne paused, looking toward the desert where the heat shimmered over distant targets. He told them how Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed had taught him without lectures. Through patience and example, she had shown him that mastery was not about rank or recognition. But discipline, care, and respect for the craft. She never raised her voice. She never demanded acknowledgement. She simply demonstrated what excellence looked like. And it left a mark that no regulation could match. Her story had become part of the base's culture. Soldiers spoke her name with respect. Instructors used her shot as a teaching point for precision and humility. Even those who had never met her felt her influence in the way teams worked together, in the way officers listened to their NCOs. Evelyn Reed was long gone now, assigned to some quiet corner of the world where skill still mattered more than title. But her presence lingered. It lived in the rhythm of every range command, in the care soldiers took when maintaining their weapons, in the silence that followed a perfect shot. Thorne turned back to his class, his tone softer. Now, he told them that legacy isn't written in plaques or reports, it's written in conduct, in the way one person makes others better, without needing to be seen. He nodded toward the brass plate, the sunlight glinting off the words, "Competence is quiet." The desert wind moved across the range, carrying the faint echo of that single, perfect moment. A reminder that true mastery never shouts. It simply endures